Hi everyone. So for our oral presentation, I decided to focus on the FCC versus the Pacifica Foundation. Now, before I decided to look at the list of cases, I didn't really have a method to choosing which case I wanted to focus on. But after I looked at it, I realized that the FCC versus the Pacifica Foundation case, it sounded familiar to me. So I decided to do further investigation. After investigating the case, I realized that I have definitely come across this case several times in communication. In communications, which is my major. So I decided to focus on this because it actually is a case that's near to my heart, considering how much it has impacted my field of study. And I feel like a lot of people who are outside of the communications department might not have any prior knowledge to this case, but it's very fundamental in just building the freedom of speech rights we have today. A basic overview of this case, it happened on Tuesday around 2 p.m., October 30th of 1973, when George Carlin, his monologue aired, and it included the 7 words you can never say on TV. I actually linked the clip to this airing on YouTube in my presentation if you guys want to take a look and look that out, because I honestly feel uncomfortable repeating all the words that were actually in that airing. And I honestly think that this was not only controversial in 1973, but it would have been very controversial if it was aired today as well. Several complaints arose from this case. Several complaints arose from this airing. One of which that actually stood out, which is what made this case stick. There was a father who was riding in the car one day with his 15-year-old son. And while they were riding, this show actually appeared on the air. Now, in his defense, he actually did state that sensitive language, which might be offensive to some, would occur during his monologue before it aired. I am assuming that the father actually did not hear that warning, but when he turned the station on, he was appalled by the language that he heard while riding in the car with his son. He raised a complaint and he tried to sue the WIAB, which is the radio station who was responsible for this airing at the time. He actually won the case, and the court ruling was a 5-4 decision, which is very close. So with the 5-4 decision, that just means that it honestly could have went either way. So he didn't win the case by a landslide, but because it was a very controversial issue. The backlash from the case was that it seemed as if though the First Amendment rights of the WIAB were actually taken away, which is why later on the WIAB ended up challenging the case. And they claimed that the court's ruling at the time was biased to children. And in his defense, I understand where he's coming from. In communications, there are several different sensitive audiences, such as children and the elderly and disabled. Those are 3 of the major sensitive audiences. But considering this time period, I think that's really what goes to blame for the gross negligence of the WIAB's First Amendment rights. And secondly, they also ignored the rights of its other stakeholders, the other audience members who actually were accepting the bad language use. The FCC is the organization that teamed up with the dad to win this case. They said that the WIAB was actually at fault because they did not actually air obscene language, but they did air indecent language. And that was their initial platform for the case. Later on, this case was actually overturned, which is not surprising, just because, like I mentioned before, not only was the WIAB's First Amendment rights ignored, the FCC was wrong in a sense, because yes, they do have the ability to monitor all language that is on the radio. They cannot take away someone's First Amendment rights. Another thing that's actually been up in the air is around this case if maybe if the FCC was not actually punished properly, because even though they ended up being the ones sued by YAB, I feel as if though they could have had a harsher punishment. Even today, currently some words and phrases are still censored on the radio. This isn't completely a direct result from this case, but this case definitely opened the gateway for censorship on the radio. And another thing that was actually brought up by not just people involved in this case, but even cases following this, was that at some point in time in history, like, children will eventually be exposed to bad language, one way or another, which is true. But I agree with that statement, but I just don't feel like it was actually valid concerning this case, because I feel as if though public stations should be sensitive to their viewers. And other people also argue that, in general, any listener has the power to change the station if there's something being aired that they don't want to see. So in short, that's a brief overview of the case. I will actually be going more in detail with this case when I actually release my analysis of the case in my final term paper. So I encourage all of you guys to read my term paper once I release it, because it will actually cover some of the gray areas of this case. And it's just really interesting to actually focus on how far we came, especially in the field of communications. But I thank you guys for listening, and I hope I shed some light on this case.